A week ago, my family and I went on a vacation to the Double Eagle Resort and Spa in June Lake, California. We stayed at one of the furthest cabins at the resort, which backed up to a forest at the bottom of granite rock formations. These rock formations separated the Inyo National Forest from the town of June Lake. The first night we stayed at the resort, June 30th, 2010, my brother, my father, and I were watching TV in the front of the cabin, and at around 11:30 p.m., we went out on our deck to look out at the amazing view we had. Within 5 minutes, the silence was broken when we heard a howl in the distance, which sounded like it was coming from the granite formations, which overlooked the resort. All of us froze. The sound scared us because we had never heard a sound like that before. The vocalization lasted under a minute. We waited for another 10 to 15 minutes out on the deck to see if whatever made the howl would howl again. But it did not howl again, so we went back inside and I took a shower. While I was showering, my brother and father continued to watch TV, but this time they opened up all the windows in the cabin to see if they could hear the howling again. When I got out of the shower 10 minutes later, my brother and father told me they heard the same sound again and again when I was in the shower. And this time, my mother, who was in bed with her window open, heard the howling too. This time there were 3 howls, which were all shorter than the first we heard on the deck, and there were only about 20 seconds in between each howl. My family and I stayed there another night, but did not hear any more howls. During the last week of June, my girlfriend and I decided to take the dogs on a long walk. We were driving up the coast, planning on a beach walk, when I decided to go to an area on Redwood Creek where my friend had heard some unusual and scary whistles and screams. He is a very experienced hunter and outdoorsman with a degree in wildlife biology and had never heard anything like it. Anyway, we were walking up the north bank, where the trails are, when I decided to cross to the south bank to check out some sandbars. I loaded up my girlfriend on my back and waded across the water. We then continued upstream a short ways when we came across 3 distinctive footprints. They were approximately 14.5 inches long. I measured them with a stick that I saved. I compared them all with my own barefoot track for depth, and they were nearly twice as deep. I weigh about 280 pounds. I was surprised they weren't wider. They were almost narrow for their length. I at first thought they were human because of this. The best print had 5 very distinct toes and was flat. No arch at all, with toes straighter across than a normal human. It appeared that it had just leisurely walked into the creek. I scoured up and down for an exit point, but the terrain wasn't suitable for tracks other than the odd sandbar. The strides were about 4 feet. It had come across a packed gravel bar, leaving a few faint impressions. Nothing else that I saw. I used to live in Bishop, California, on the eastern side of the Sierra Nevada mountains. I have spent lots of time camping, hiking, fishing, and skiing in the Sierra backcountry. I am familiar with many kinds of animal sounds and signs in the mountains. Last weekend, we were camping at the Sawmill Walk-in Campground on the east side of Yosemite National Park. After sunset, as dusk was deepening, we were sitting around our camp table talking. From the direction of the forests that line the canyon floor, towards a mountain in the west, a series of whoop howls rang out from the distance and rolled down the canyon. My sister was talking and immediately stopped, turned around and said, "What is that?" The calls continued for a few more moments, and then ceased. When the calls started, all other normal background wildlife noise stopped, and did not resume until several seconds after the calls ceased. There were no answers to the original call, nor did it repeat. That area of Yosemite is relatively deserted, and the Sawmill Walk-in Campground only has a few sites that are scattered widely. The trail that runs through the campground eventually leads to the top of the mountain and branches into the back country. I have never had an experience like this before, but hope I one day have the opportunity to have a visual encounter with one of these beings. On a day after the snow had fallen, we went hunting up in the Lake Hughes area in California. There were 4 of us hunting that day, my dad and myself and 2 good buddies. Well, the deer hunting was not that good that day, so one of my buddies said to us, "My wife's uncle is gone from his cabin and won't be back any time soon. So why don't we visit his land and just hang out and all have some lunch?" Well, he lives by Lake Hughes Road and close to where we were. We went over there and unlocked the gate as he had a key. We went in there and we had brought some apples for our lunch and all. We had seen some hogs and started feeding them apples. After about an hour and a half of doing this, we heard the horses behind the house or cabin running around and making all kinds of noise. We could not see what was going on, as the house was in the way, but man, were they going nuts. So we all said to each other, "Let's get over there and see what's up." We did and could not see anything but the horses still going nuts and running in circles. We then looked over the fence and through a gate and seen these huge footprints and smelt something like a dog's that's been wet and rotten eggs mixed. Well, the gate was locked and he went inside the cabin or house and got a key for the gate. So we went over to the prints, and I'm 6'5" at this time and weighed 275 pounds. I have a shoe size of 15 4E. These tracks were much bigger than my shoe, and they were made with some of them in the snow. I stepped next to them and could not press down and going that deep. I could go maybe 3/4 to 1 inch down. These prints were 4 inches deep in the snow. They were also 2 to 3 inches longer than my foot and much wider. Then I tried to step that far with my step, and no way could I. Then we followed the tracks until they came to this really steep hill. There, this thing went up to this hill on 2 legs and stepped high enough that even my good buddy, who was a bodybuilder and in great shape, could not climb. I could not even lift my leg that far, and I was 16 years old and pretty limber. No man could lift their leg that high or step that far. No man. Nowhere did we see bear tracks, and even if we did, they don't walk that far on 2 legs. Whatever this was, it walked along this fence and turned and went back into the woods, and then up this very steep hill. It must have looked at the horses and maybe seen us feeding the hogs. I never seen it, but we got scared and left the ranch. I have told this story to a few people, and they look at me. It could be, but you can tell. They don't think it's real. But when you see things like this, you just know something is out there. Nobody can change my mind on this one. I know what I seen, and it is not set up. Nobody knew we were going to his ranch. And the next ranch over, nobody was home there either. So the only thing that could be is, this was real and not fake. Nowhere did we see any human footprints by any of these tracks or up that steep hill. I know something is going on up there. In 1978, I was alone and gold hunting up behind the Hoopa Valley Indian Reservation. I had to take a side trip across the mountain to avoid some heavy snow and brush. I found this trail that was going up the mountain, where there were large steps in the trail that were throwing my climbing stride off. At this point, this side of the mountain that I was on was bald, and it was open ground with no trees or brush close by to hide behind. Suddenly, I had this very bad feeling. Then the hair on the back of my neck stood up, straight up. I never had that happen to me before or since. I believe this happened for no other reason except fear. I then left this out of stride trail. Actually, I ran off the trail, feeling terrified of something that was coming down the same trail. I only got a short way off when I went down on my knees and covered my face and eyes with both hands and tried to hide. At that moment, I heard an animal on 2 legs come down the trail, just a few yards from me. It stopped, and it had to gaze right at me for a while. Then it continued on down the hill. I didn't look until after it left and continued on down the mountain out of sight, so I never saw this animal. I believe this creature was directing a silent feeling toward me, and I complied. At this point in my life, I had been a seasoned mountain man and have had numerous encounters with many kinds of animals, including bears and deer, day and night, but nothing like this. With no more fear, I returned to the trail feeling fine. I thought of Bigfoot right away. This time I paid close attention to detail. There was no odor or smell, and the only odd thing was that the trail became fainter as I continued to climb up on this mountain. I had expected this trail to lead somewhere, like a cave perhaps, but no, it just ended at a small meadow. I looked all around, and I could see there was a limestone ridge outcropping in the distance, but no signs of a cave. This encounter was really something to remember, and it was just my experience. There isn't any need for the so-called experts to tell me anything. They will just have to get their own experience. Besides, it's not like they're in the loop. We, which is my husband, my son, and myself, were in Mono Lake this past weekend, Sunday, August 21st, 2005, for a day hike to Roosevelt Lake and its twin. We arrived at the lakes at approximately 11 a.m. and fished until about 2:30 p.m., at which time we decided to head back down the trail for home. There were quite a few hikers in the area over the course of the day, approximately 13 hikers and a pack train consisting of 4 riders and 8 horses and a dog, some coming in, some going out. Anyway, we headed down the trail following the pack train. We stopped on the way down to read the sign about the wagons that tried to use that trail way back in the day. I heard a noise like someone else coming down the trail behind us and told my family, let's get going. The trail was pretty dry and dusty, and my husband kept insisting that we give the hikers ahead of us some time so we could avoid walking in their dust. The next section of trail was slightly uphill, so after cresting the top and going a short distance down the other side, we stopped for a water break. We heard what we thought was a shout. My son shouted back and something answered, but the echo was pretty bad, so we couldn't make out what was being said. We continued on down the trail and had just approached the south end of the meadows when my husband says, "What is that?" Both my son and I stopped and looked across the river toward the meadow. From the beginning, it was a strange sight, because this large black thing appeared to be floating across the meadow. At first, I thought it was a backpacker, perhaps riding a bike, because it was moving so quickly across the meadow. It was moving quickly and smoothly. It didn't make sense. If it was a backpacker, to be moving that fast, he would have to be running, and running with a backpack is anything but smooth. If he was riding a bike, then why couldn't I see the bike? And its arms and legs were in line with its body, not bent at an angle like it was sitting on something. Also, the color. I couldn't figure out why a backpacker would be wearing black. Black cap, black backpack, black pants, and a black coat. It was at least 80 to 85 degrees out. We stood and watched silently for a time, perhaps 15 seconds. The speed and smoothness which it traveled was mesmerizing. Then my husband and son took off running further up the trail to another vantage point. They continued to watch it silently. Then, just shortly after I caught up to them, my son yelled, and the thing stopped and turned toward us. It didn't turn as a human would turn, even one wearing a backpack. Then it began moving across the meadow again, not faster or slower, just the same floating type pace. We were on the trail above the meadow, looking down and approximately 500 to 800 yards away from the object. My husband believes the thing was following the pack trail. We left the trail and went down to the meadow. We stayed on the trail side of the river. The thing was on the opposite side of the river. By this time it was gone or hidden from us. The best way to describe it is like this. The thing had the head that sat directly on its shoulders. It did not appear to have a neck. That is why we at first thought it was a backpacker. It went head, broad shoulders or backpack, no neck, and large body. We could not discern its legs or arms, due mostly to the angle at which it was leaving us. The grass in the meadow obscured some of the legs. We have spent many hours in the woods. My husband was raised in Plumas County. Neither he nor I have ever seen anything like this. It could not have been a bear. They can't walk that far on two legs, nor that smoothly or quickly. First, as a matter of background, I want to tell a little about myself. It will help explain the delay in ever having reposted this incident. The sighting occurred about 3 months prior to my entering the United States Army. I served for 3 years as a paratrooper with a top secret clearance. After my time in the service, I became a Los Angeles police officer. I did that for 13 years and am now a federal agent, working for the OIG out of Washington, D.C. With that background, you can probably understand my reluctance to discuss this sighting with too many people. It really boils down to a potential career killer. That being said, the incident did occur, and I remember it vividly. Many years after the event, I reconnected with my friend, who was the witness, and asked him to tell me the story as he recalled it. I wanted to check my memory and see if it matched mine. It did. To a T. Only a few months ago, I spoke with my brother-in-law, a witness after the fact. I asked him if he remembered the event. He did. It should be known that he is not the kind of person that would buy into such a story. He had not been semi-involved. Anyway, this is what happened. My friend Craig and I were both 17 years old and waiting to leave for Army basic training. He was due to leave in June, and I would go in August of 1980. We were staying with my sister and brother-in-law at the time. They lived in a cabin in Green Valley, California. Craig and I enjoyed our last months as civilians in that area, and used it to train for the difficult training ahead of us. We ran every day along the mountain roads and hiked the hills, trying to get into prime shape. In May, we decided to test ourselves and camp out for a full 7 days. We knew the perfect place for this would be what we called the old campground, because of its isolated surroundings and terrain that would be perfect for climbing and hiking. So, we packed up a week's worth of supplies, and though my sister Cindy and her husband Tom offered to drive us, we decided to act like soldiers and walk to the location. We did this with full packs. My sister and Tom advised us that they would check on us at least every other day, and that they would bring us food and lemonade and such. Tom also offered to provide us with 2 weapons to be used for protection against any strangers that might try to harm us. After all, this was before cell phones, and we would be on our own big time. There was also a heavy rattlesnake threat in that area, so we happily took him up on the offer. Tom met us at an area near the mine shafts later that day and gave us an M1 rifle and a 12-gauge shotgun, ammo for both as well. The dirt trail that leads off the main highway goes very far back into the mountains. In fact, where you traverse it to its end, you would end up on top of what is known as Grass Mountain. Craig and I decided to get about 3 miles in and away from the highway, which was about a mile past what was once an old 1920s campground, and live deep in the bush like soldiers would. We found a great spot, next to a clear running creek, and set up our tent in the clearing that was there. This clearing was completely surrounded by thick woods. Then, night fell. As we laid in our tents, talking by the light of flashlights, we both heard the very loud snap of deadfall in the woods behind the tent. We sat up, frozen and listening. We heard what sounded like a very large and heavy person, slowly walking around our sight, making no effort to conceal his presence. Judging from the loud sound of breaking sticks and brush, we were both scared, believing that someone was out there. We exited the tent, Craig with the shotgun and me with the M1. I started yelling very loud, "Hey, we know you are there. We have guns and we'll shoot." Again, we heard the sound of somebody walking slowly, but methodically, around from our left to right. We shined our lights in the direction, but could not see anything but the trees and brush. We talked amongst ourselves, wondering if it could be a bear or something, but we decided that it was a person and not an animal. After much yelling and warning that we would shoot, I decided to fire a few rounds in the direction of the noise. How crazy that sounds now, and I did just that. I fired about 3 rounds into the trees, and the sound was unbelievable. The weapon blasted, and the sound echoed into the night, roaring into the canyons and fading off into the night air. We stood in silence. To our utter disbelief and eventual horror, whatever it was began to move again, still left to right, in a circle around us. What we both thought and discussed later was that no animal would have stuck around after the horrific noise of the M1. Most normal people would have not stuck around either. Whoever or whatever was out there not only stuck around, but appeared from the casual sound of the slow walking to be less than concerned about our weapons. We made a decision to vacate the area post-haste. Grabbing our coats, we climbed the embankment up the dirt road, carrying our weapons. We ran the entire way, about 3 miles more or less, back to the main highway. We spent a very long night, curled up in a concrete drainage ditch, waiting for the sun to rise. Every hour or so, a lone truck would come by, and the sound of that brought us comfort. Again, it was a long night. The next day, we hiked back to the site, expecting to find our tent and all of our supplies missing. To our surprise, everything was as we had left it. Nothing was out of place. We gathered our things and hiked back to the open area of the old campground. We decided to not sleep in the tent because it limited our vision, and instead laid our sleeping bags out in an open area above the creek. After a day of climbing cliffs and cooking and such, night fell again. That night, just as the sun set and darkness was beginning to fall, Craig and I were walking in the direction of the main road. We were looking for rattlesnakes because we had shot one earlier on the dirt road in the same area. As we walked side by side with me on the left, both holding weapons, we saw it. Standing just on the dirt road, facing us, was a Bigfoot. There can be no doubt at all about what it was. We could see it very clearly. He was about 8 or 9 feet tall and stood with his left shoulder even with the edge of the trail. He was covered with dark hair and had long arms. We did not smell anything unusual, as I have since read about other sightings. The strange thing about him was the absolute indifference in his expression. He did not look threatening. He did not look scared. He just stood there looking at us, almost bored. I instinctively brought my right hand up against Craig's chest, and we both stopped dead in our tracks. We never took our eyes off the Bigfoot as we spoke. I said, "Do you see that? Are we seeing this?" And Craig just said, "What do we do? What should we do?" We both started to walk backwards as we spoke, very slowly and involuntarily. The Bigfoot just looked at us for a few moments. Then, I will never forget the detail of this. He just slowly and very casually turned to his left and began to walk into the forest. When he did that, Craig and I stopped and started talking over each other. "Do we shoot it? Should we shoot it? What do we do? Do you want to follow it?" As we talked, we heard a sound that we both immediately recognized from the prior night. The sound of the Bigfoot slowly walking deeper into the woods, breaking deadfall, twigs and branches as he went. We never did fire a shot or follow him. We stayed up late and slept in shifts at the campground and did not hear from the Bigfoot again. The next day, Tom came up with food and supplies. We ran to him and told him the details of what had happened. It was very clear by his expression that he did not believe us. We took him to the exact spot where we saw the Bigfoot, and we discovered a trail of giant footprints leading from the trail into the woods. Tom smiled and told us that we did a good job making them. We were so frustrated and begged Tom to follow the tracks with us. We all followed them, and they went into and across the creek. On the other side, we found a large red anthill with a footprint right on top of it. I asked Tom, how could we have done that? He just shook his head and smiled. We followed the tracks to a point where 2 large hills formed a valley that sloped upwards into the mountain. The ground turned rocky, and the prints stopped. That is what happened. I have lived with this memory for many years. I am now 45 years old and am less concerned about what people think of me in terms of this incident. It is a fact, and because of it, I know for sure that Bigfoot lives, or at least once lived, in the area of Green Valley, California. My dad, my brother, and I were deer hunting just north, about half a mile, of Donner Lake, California, along the utility road running east and west. They left me with my dog, a beagle, on a large boulder while they went east along the road in the pickup truck. They were going to try to flush some deer out of the brush and have them run towards me in the clearing under the utility lines. They must have driven several miles because all was quiet until I looked up towards the top of the ridge behind me and to my right, towards Donner Lake, and saw a tall, between 8 to 9 feet tall, ape-like creature, sandy brown in color, rather lean and especially graceful in stride, walking smoothly and rapidly down the top of the ridge towards the utility road, crossing the road about 40 yards from where I sat on top of the boulder, which was about 8 feet tall, with a loaded .30-30 rifle across my lap. My dog, Tippy, ran off barking at the creature, disappearing in the pine trees about 30 yards north of the utility road. I was scared stiff, but knew that I was downwinded of the Bigfoot, and he apparently did not see me. I had no thought of shooting him, as I did not have any confidence that I could stop him with my rifle. I could hear my dog barking for a long time, 10 or 15 minutes, all the time getting further away. I waited for about an hour and 30 minutes before the dog finally returned, and my dad and brother returned about 30 minutes later. I never told anyone about this until many years later. I thought they would think I was crazy. I had never heard of a Bigfoot at the time and did not become aware of other sightings until several years later. On July 13th, or August 17th of 2000, about 7:15 p.m., my boyfriend, my 2-month-old baby, and I were headed back from Eureka, California, to Crescent City, California. Somewhere past Trinidad, and right before the lagoon, we came around the corner on a 4-lane highway. Up ahead, around 50 yards away, a tall, dark brown, almost black man with long hair all over ran full stride across the highway. His arms hung long, and the top of his neck seemed somewhat hunched over. The first thing that ran through my mind was, what's a man doing running across the road right here? I thought this because we were completely out in the middle of nowhere. Then I yelled, "That was a Bigfoot!" My boyfriend turned to me and said, "Shut up, you're playing with me." I told him that he saw it with his own eyes. By this time, we had passed the point where he ran across the road into the forest, so we stopped and turned around. We drove back to the point where we had re-entered the forest and stopped. Peering into the thick forest, it became too spooky for me, and I drove off. I noticed where and when he chose to cross the road was very unique. He waited until there were no cars except for ours, which caught him off guard just coming around the corner, and where he crossed was flat. It was the only place throughout the woods that didn't have a little hill on either side of the highway. Some of the people I have told this to ask if it was a bear, but there is no way it could have been a bear at the speed that this thing ran. I am a long-term seasonal with the U.S. Forest Service. I do know the different tracks the wildlife leaves behind. What I and a coworker saw was not a typical wildlife track. On this day, we decided to go to the Paiute Mountain to cover illegal OHV trails. As the day was going, we covered 5 illegal trails around the Landers Meadow area, then decided to head for the Weldon and Woolstaff Meadow area. As we were heading towards the Weldon Meadow area, a rancher stopped us to ask if we saw some of his cattle. Our reply was no. If we see them, though, we'll let you know. We never found them. At Weldon Meadow, we stopped for lunch, and this was our next area to work. During lunch, the coworker went to do a little exploring. After about 10 minutes, the coworker yelled to me to come see and ID some wildlife tracks. These were not wildlife tracks. We saw what looked like something like a human foot track, but it was way too big with a slight distortion in the toe. The tracks measured about 16 inches long and 7 inches wide. The tracks looked like the ones I saw last year at the Six Rivers National Forest. I snapped a picture of the track and looked to see where the tracks were going. The tracks followed the barbed wire fence. The meadow area is used for cattle grazing. The coworker asked me what it meant. I just said, "It's possible that Bigfoot was looking for food or was heading for the spring at the end of the fence." We then proceeded to do our work so that we could finish this area and head for the other area. We finished and headed towards the Woolstaff Meadow area. Once down there, we proceeded to do our job. While working on the project, I spotted the same tracks that we saw earlier. The tracks cut across the trail and headed towards some rock outcroppings. This was enough to spook my coworker, and so we left the area. Back at the office, the coworker told me what we saw and was laughed at. I didn't tell them that I snapped pictures of the tracks. I too would have been laughed at. First of all, I am a 55-year-old male, former Marine, fireman, and state police officer, just recently retired. I have been all over the world in the military and an avid camper. I have often heard of Bigfoot and thought possible, not likely. Although I didn't believe they existed, I kept an open mind. I have seen many things in my time that were hard to explain, but were not as vivid as the following. I was driving on Route 80 in California at 14:30 hours. On August 16th, 2004, I had just passed the truck inspection station and state workyard, which was west of the Donner Pass. As I was crossing over a bridge which crossed over a ravine with a river through it, I looked down into the ravine and saw what looked like about 7 to 8 foot tall, broad-shouldered, possibly male, all black from head to toe, a form stepping from the tree line on the west bank, approximately 300 to 400 yards south of the bridge. I immediately pulled over to the side of the roadway on the bridge and slowed so that I could see it better. Traffic was extremely light since there was only 2 other cars. When I looked down, I was able to see that the form had no identifiable clothing or any lines or hat. It was then walking in a lanky movement with arms swinging as it crossed the stream and river. I then noticed a slightly smaller figure, 6 to 7 foot tall, possibly male due to no obvious breasts or feminine movements, come out from the tree line behind the other male, trailing him by about 30 feet and slightly south by about 10 feet. They both continued across the stream and into the tree line on the east side and disappeared. I sat there, trying to evaluate what I had seen. I then concluded that these forms were not any animals I've ever seen. They were one solid color from head to toe, with no discernible clothing. They had nothing in their hands or on their feet. I could not come up with any possible concept as to why these individuals would be out there. The temperature was extremely warm, so the clothing, if it was clothing, was way too much. Their faces and hands were the same color as their body. I then proceeded with no further sighting. I was about 14 years old, riding a horse on a ranch that my family owned. The ranch location is somewhere in California. I won't disclose where. I was on a trail going towards the edge of the forest, still on our property. When I reached the edge of the forest, there was a dead cow. It had been dead for some time now, because it was mostly just bones. When I looked around, still on my horse, that's when I saw a Bigfoot. He was really tall, black, and so human-like. He looked at me, but was not scared. I said to myself, that's Bigfoot. Bigfoot had one hand and arm leaning up against a giant tree, and he looked to be both man and ape. Bigfoot looked right at me, and we both just looked at each other. I was so scared that I turned around and went back to the ranch. I've blocked this out of my mind for many years. I believe from being scared to death. I spoke to my dad about the ranch. I asked him, do we still own 10,000 acres in the ranch? He said no, and is now 90 years old. I asked him, did anybody ever say they saw Bigfoot? And he said yes. I could take you to the spot where I saw him, and I'm sure somebody who lives in that area would say they have seen him also. Why? Because he is there. He is out there, living. This happened 28 years ago, but I remember it very clear now for some reason, and how he looked at me. My neighbor is a seasonal wildlife biological technician for Redwood National Park. He has been working several seasons doing spotted owl surveys and is very familiar with local wildlife. One evening just before sunset, he and his partner were walking with a cage of 6 mice that had sat in the same cage without being cleaned for 3 or 4 days, and it smelt to high hell. They were several miles south of Bald Hills Road at about 2,000 feet up, an approximately 3,000-foot mountain, in extremely rugged and isolated terrain, several miles from the nearest logging road. After bushwhacking for about 30 minutes, heading downhill, they stopped in their tracks when they heard a large branch snap. There are a lot of bears and mountain lions in the area, and they are familiar with the stalking cats. The creature was quick and agile like a cat, but sounded heavier than a bear. It also sounded like it was walking on 2 legs. They would hear it behind them, and a little later, it would be way ahead of them, sometimes on the other side of them. They figured it was crossing right behind them, and then passing them up on the other side. By this time, it was getting dark in the forest, late twilight, when my friend started looking over his shoulder quite frequently. It was at this time that he saw a large dark animal dash across their trail on 2 legs. He has seen the PG film and is familiar with Sasquatch, and he says that it moved with the same motion, just much quicker. He also noted it seemed a little thinner than Patty. I lived in the high desert of California in Ridgecrest in Kern County from 1980 to 1985. I did a lot of hiking in the Sierra Nevada mountains. I never saw or heard of anything unusual during that time. My mom, sister, and family, and brother, and his family still live there. My 19-year-old son and I were visiting various family members from September 17th to September 27th, 2007, in Ridgecrest, California. My sister took me and my son up to Seibert Family Gold Mine, cabin, and mining equipment on the 24th of September. We had spent about an hour at this location, and we were preparing to leave. My sister was in the porta potty, and my son and I heard this high-pitched scream, like a woman hollering. We yelled back, thinking it was a woman in trouble, but there was no reply. I asked my sister if she had heard it, and she said no. I told her what we had heard, and she told me that she had a horse backed and hiked through this area and had never heard anything that would make that kind of sound. She has lived in this area since 1980. I asked her husband, who's an avid hunter, horseback trail rider, and hiker in these mountains, and he said that he knew of no animal that made a high-pitched scream in this area. My brother-in-law also lived in Ridgecrest, California area all of his life. During the weekend of May 26th and 27th, I was conducting a sound survey project with 3 other people near the town of Johnson and the Klamath River. This area we were in had a sighting last year, around the month of July. The place where we decided to set up was a recent clear cut that ran along the hillside. It was about 1,000 feet wide and 1,200 feet long. On the edges were fir and oak trees that developed a thick cover. Running the width and centered in the clear cut was a dirt road that the local people and loggers used on a daily basis. It also provided us with a place to park and set up our sound equipment. It also became base for our team. From our base, looking down into the valley, about 2 miles, we could see the town of Johnson. From our point, we were about 1,500 feet above the river and town. Just prior to dusk, I had 2 members climb to the top of the clear cut, about 150 feet in elevation and about 300 feet away from the base. I did this so if anything was to come closer to our base camp, they would have the best field of vision, and with their night vision device would be able to determine what it was. We also had 2-way portable radios for the upper lookout and base. Manny and myself continued to set up the equipment and waited until nightfall. Because I was scheduled to participate at 10 p.m. in a live broadcast with Jeff Rent's sightings program, I was ensuring that my bag cell phone was working properly. All the equipment checked out other than the phone worked but had some static in the line. At 9:40, we started the broadcast. The sound traveled very well and seemed to echo forever. The location we were at easily helped the sound to travel well over 5 miles from valley to ridgetop and saddle. It covered a very large area. Very happy with the sound, we continued to broadcast a few more times before the sightings show started. It was almost 10 p.m. when the phone rang. It was the sightings show. The show went fine for the first few minutes, but the static was getting horrendous, cutting Jeff off completely at times. About 10 minutes into the show, Jeff asked me to try and find another location where the reception might be a little better. A commercial was playing at the time, so I quickly contacted the upper team and Manny and told them that I had to move. I started my vehicle and drove about 600 feet towards the tree line. I reconnected to the show and was relieved that it was a better connection. I was in this new location less than 15 feet to the tree line, with visibility not over 5 feet into the trees. I was parked for a few minutes and heard what I thought was a bear charging me. I am in a convertible with the window down, not much protection in anyone's mind. I looked for my revolver and it was gone. I must have forgot it with Manny when I was in a hurry to get into a better location. I sat there for a second, and again I heard this charging that sounded like a few feet away from me. This time, I started my car and got on the radio and told the upper team that I was moving out because of something charging me in the bush. Manny didn't have a radio, as we were together at base camp and had to share 2, one for base and one for the upper team. I asked the upper team, "Do you see anything?" And they replied no. I decided to wait it out, as this thing could expose itself to me, although I just realized that my camera was also with Manny. The show continued on, and I would hear footfalls, breaking branches, and at least one grunt growl. I kept asking the upper team if they could see anything, and they kept saying no. I at least had a flashlight, but didn't want to use it in fear that I would scare off whatever it was. Obviously, I was becoming very concerned for my safety, not knowing what it was, but I remained there on a chance I might be able to see a Bigfoot, or at least see something. I heard the charging again and again, and finally a crackle in the radio. "John, it's looking right at you. Can't you see it? It's about 25 feet away. That bastard is huge." My heart started pounding fast, and trying to carry on with this live program without sounding distracted was even harder. The other upper team member confirmed what they were looking at. It was something that was at least 8 feet tall, with shoulders that were 4 feet across. As I sat in my car, cell phone to one ear and the other to the forest, I could hear it charge again, and that's when they would say it went back into the trees. This happened several times. This sighting went on for several minutes, with the Squatch looking at me by moving its body from side to side, trying to get a better look through the trees and brush. It was also observing, moving its arms in a quick motion, as if signaling to others. This whole incident from first charge heard to the last tree branch breaking lasted about 30 minutes. It was by far one of the most intense moments in my life. That next day, we did search the area and found the soil disturbed where this Squatch was spotted. Due to the soil condition, it did not allow any prints to be left. Judging from a tree and stump in the area, it was determined that it was at least 8 feet tall, but closer to 9 feet. From the Squatch's point of view, it had several windows to look at me, and by moving its body from side to side, it would have a clear view of my entire vehicle and me. Me and a friend at the time were hiking in the Angeles National Forest. My friend was just out of boot camp, USMC, and we started hiking as often as time would allow. We were hiking down a small stream bed that went downhill. The stream was all dried up, and it was mostly rock hopping until we got to the bottom of the hill. At one point, there is a small section off to the side that is just dirt and makes for a much easier walk down to the bottom. When we got to the bottom, we hiked a bit more, but as the sun started to go down, we headed back up the same hill, creek bed. I followed my own boot tracks back up as I was tired of rock hopping. While going up, the smell in the air was horrible, like rotten eggs or portable toilet. I then noticed on one of my tracks laid a dead ground squirrel right over my boot track. I pointed this out to my friend, and as soon as I did this, a loud banging over a short hillside was heard. It was coming from about 35 to 50 yards away from us. It sounded as if a large log being hit against a tree. I looked at where the noise was coming from and noticed the tops of the trees were swaying back and forth. All this time of the swaying of the trees, the pounding on them could be heard. Then the pounding stopped, and a loud groan and scream were heard from the same area as the pounding of the trees. I have never heard anything like it. I've heard mountain lion, black bear. This was nothing like that, and it was very, very loud, to the point it was damn scary. My friend asked if we should look over the small hillside to see what was making the noise. I told him no way, and he agreed. When we started walking away, the banging and screaming would stop, but as soon as we stopped, it would proceed with the groan and screaming, and the trees would start swaying again. We finally got out of there, and my friend did not want to talk about what happened. This happened about 24 years ago, but it is still fresh in my mind. I guess you never really forget these types of experiences. It was late July of 1977. My family was up in the eastern Sierras near Mono Lake, approximately 13 to 15 miles above Conway Summit, in an area known as Virginia Lakes. My dad told my brother and I to go to the lake and gather firewood. It was late in the day, and the sun was down, but it wasn't dark yet, only dusk. I was 14 years old, and my brother was 1 month shy of 16. He had his learner's permit, so we were allowed to take the truck. We got to the lake and started loading up on some wood. I had just returned to the truck and dropped the wood when I heard what I thought was someone walking through the brush. The footfalls were very heavy, almost like someone was jumping, but the steps seemed pretty rapidly placed. Where we were gathering wood was near a large hedge of bushes, approximately 6 to 7 feet high and very dense, with only one path through the bush to skirt the lake without wading in the water. I turned into the bushes, where the sound was coming from, and saw the bushes shaking and bending, as if something large was moving through the bushes, making a lot of noise. I watched for a few seconds when my brother came running to the truck, white as a ghost and eyes bulging wide. I said, "Jeff, what was that?" He was scared and out of breath. "I don't know, but let's get out of here," he said. We jumped back into the truck and drove all out. On the way back to camp, he told me that he was only 10 or 15 feet away from it. He heard the stomping and crashing of the brush and turned to see a large, dark brown head above the bushes moving rapidly away from him. He didn't see a face. He was so scared, he crashed the truck into a tree on the way back to camp. My dad was pretty pissed, to say the least, and didn't believe our story, even when we were crying because of how frightened we were. He finally calmed down and said that we probably saw a bear. But bears do not walk through heavy brush on two legs, and my brother swore that it was not a bear. I think my dad started to believe that we saw something, since we both would not go out of the campfire that night, and both of us refused to go to the lake alone for the rest of the trip. Since that time, I have told several people with very few people actually believing me. Most told me that Bigfoot are only in the Northwest, in Oregon and Washington, but after hearing other encounters, I feel a bit vindicated. At approximately 9:30 p.m., we were in the process of setting up our second tent. There were 6 of us in the party, and maintaining the campfire when, from directly across the road and meadow, we heard a type of whistle, or double whoop sound. Try whistling the syllables whew, whew, and it was immediately followed by a very intense screech, which I can only compare to a bear cub in danger, combined with the intensity of a hawk shriek. One of our younger members, who's 15, insists that it sounded like a possessed woman. Now, I grew up in the mountains of Montana, and am familiar with many animals and their sounds, and have never heard anything like this in my life. And until this moment, I have wondered what it was like to have the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I have never felt this kind of reaction. I repeat, never. The sound sequence repeated itself again, followed by a third lone screech. Immediately, we panned the forestry line with our flashlights, with the intent of at least seeing the reaction of an animal's eyes. Nothing. We must have lighted the area for nearly 10 minutes, followed the sound, and still saw nothing. As time wore on, we began to relax and go about our business of finishing the tent setup and dinner. Then, at about 12:30 a.m., just past midnight, with 2 of the teenagers already asleep, we again heard the whistle whoop, immediately followed by the screech, but this time directly behind our campsite, up the slope near the picnic areas amongst the trees. Again, we panned the area with lights. I broke out the 2 million candle power gangbuster spotlight, and it lit the night. And still nothing. No movement, no eyes, nothing. After panning around the entire area once again, I noticed movement on the road towards the restrooms, and we quickly moved the light in that direction. Walking across the road was a tiny little gray fox, or kit fox. Well, for our needs, that was our mystery animal, we thought. We figured it yelped and then made that nasty screech for some other reason. Funny, but that was enough confirmation for us, and we went to bed for the night. At approximately 5:30 a.m., 3 of us woke up at the same time, and after a minute or 2 of silence, we heard the whistle whoop, followed immediately by the intense screech, and this followed again by a lone screech. But this time, the sound was only about 20 feet from our tent, as if it was standing directly on the paved road next to our campsite. We were all unnerved somewhat, but agreed it's just that darn fox again, and didn't bother to jump up out of the video cameras or spotlights. I exchanged words with a person in the other tent, not sure if this chased it away, but we then heard the same whistle and screech again, but far off in the distance, as if it were a quarter-mile away. This was the end of our encounter. The following morning, we checked the area for any signs of tracks and found nothing. We also nearly walked the entire circumference of the lake shore, searching for signs of any kind of anything, and got nothing. My name is JM, and my friend's name is RS, and we were hiking about a mile above Sand Canyon in California. He lost his prescription sunglasses, and we split up to search for them. As I was hiking, I saw a very strange track. It looked human, but it was larger than any human footprint. Also, unless a human was walking a mile from the road barefoot through rough terrain, it couldn't have been a human. I met up with RS, and on the way back, I showed him the print. He is an Army veteran from Iraq and an avid hunter, and he was simply shocked by the footprint. He said to me, "Jay, look, you can even see the toe prints. This creature has to be at least 7 feet tall." We looked at each other, and I asked him, "How old do you think that print is?" He answered, "It looks to be about 3 days old." We both decided after finding his sunglasses, we should head back to the car, while keeping a very sharp lookout for anything strange. After we had reached home, it started to snow. We both realized it was very fortunate that we got to see that, because the snow would have wiped it out. I found a 3-toed footprint and a 13.5-inch footprint sometime after 6 p.m. I have plaster casts and footage of the prints before I made casts out of them. I fell asleep about 9:30 p.m. While sleeping, I was woken up to noises outside of my tent. The first noise I heard was leaves being stepped on, but I told myself it's nothing a couple of times. I began to fall back asleep when I started to hear it again, but this time it was louder and heavier. The thing that started to get to me and concern me was the fact that I had started to feel the vibration in the ground every time that it took a step. I was facing stomach down when I woke up, so I just lay there listening, and all of a sudden, the noises stopped. Whatever was out there was breaking branches on the ground, and I also heard a couple of branches breaking on the trees. Then, the noises started again. By then I was starting to get scared because, for one thing, I couldn't see outside my tent, and the other thing was that I was alone. The noises stopped, and I made up my mind to go outside, so I started to unzip the inside of the tent, and as I did, I tripped trying to get outside. By then, I got up and turned on my flashlight, spun around but seen nothing and smelt nothing. Whatever was out there didn't make any more noise, but I knew whatever it was still there. I would estimate the noise were less than 30 feet away, probably closer. That's just how close it was. I then grabbed my tent, ran with it to my truck, threw it in the back, grabbed the rest of my stuff, and I was gone. I was in the area north of Mammoth during that same week, maybe 10 miles north of the report's location. I have been visiting a fly fishing location on the Owens River for 5 years in a row during the first week of May in the same location, kinda midway between Mammoth and June Lakes. My friend and I heard 3 very loud, very long screams on the night of the 3rd of May. We were backpacking in my truck to get loaded up to go home the next day. As we backed into the next cabin, we suddenly heard a terrifying scream about 10 seconds in duration. It sounded like it was right behind the truck, and we had the windows all closed up. We just ran, sat there, and were saying to each other, "What the hell was that?" We thought we ran over a deer or something big. I immediately turned the truck around and hit the high beams. Nothing. So we opened the windows a few inches, and just then, another scream. This time it sounded off of the side of my truck and a bit further away, maybe 20 or so, or 30 yards. Once again, about 30 seconds later, one more scream, a little shorter this time and further away. It was definitely moving away from us. At this point, we saw some people in a cabin about 200 yards away, shining flashlights up and down the mountainside. I questioned one of the people in that cabin at 7 a.m. next morning outside as he passed our cabin, but he denied hearing anything at all last night. I know, very strange. I recall him saying it was probably a rabbit. I have heard rabbit screams when they get bitten, and it was not that for sure. Too loud and long anyway. Needless to say, we were freaked out pretty bad, and took 10 minutes or so to get up the courage to go into the cabin. Hate to admit it, but we moved tables against the doors that night, and I moved my bed away from the window to the middle of the room. I have some lingering doubts, however, that what we heard may have been a mountain lion, maybe. The sound was very similar to the Ohio Bigfoot screams, but higher in pitch and what I would call angrier sounding. It was also very threatening sounding. Had been riding horses with 3 other friends on the 6-hour loop trail and stopped for lunch where the outhouse is located at the one-day trail junction. We were all sitting at the picnic table having lunch and was hearing much crashing in the brush. Not unusual sounds, for there are elk everywhere in the park. We did notice, however, that a bear or something had an awfully good time with the outhouse toilet paper, as it was strung all over the place. We were all sitting there, having lunch, and I decided that I wanted to go see where the elk were, maybe see a big bull. So I got on my horse and rode down to where I heard the noise, and the trail is cut out on an old logging road, and a creek crosses through a culvert to the other side of the road. and the water forms a small pool before moving on down into the larger creek below. I could not tell you how long I was sitting there on my horse, watching this creature not more than 30 feet away trying to get a drink of water out of the pool. It was a challenge, as the sides to the pool were fairly steep. At first, I thought it was a man, and then a monkey, and at last my brain registered what exactly I was looking at. Then I seen the fingernail, and it was black and human-like. I was looking at an adolescent, possibly baby Bigfoot. It never had a chance to turn and to look at me, as the horse I was on kept getting more and more upset the longer that I stayed there. I ran back on my horse to my friends, and told them in a stuttered manner what I had seen. Just by the way I was acting, they knew something was up, because I have been in the woods on horseback almost half of my life. They immediately followed me back to the area where I had seen what I described as a young adolescent Bigfoot. My friends did not ever see the creature though, but they heard it as it walked away and seen the ferns moving as it rustled through them on its way down the hill to the larger creek. Never heard any sounds from him or her. My friend was going to follow, and I cautioned her, because I believed that Mom was close by. The crashing in the brush we heard was not made by the adolescent-looking creature. It was made by something much larger. The creature was silver gray, had medium-length hair, like a bear, black human-like fingernails, human-like hands, I seen its thumbs, was totally covered in hair from top to bottom. I never got to see its face. It was always looking down. I never have told anyone about the sighting, and made my friends promise not to say anything for quite a while. I explained that this was a young animal, and to allow me to get this close was an experience. And if I could get that close on a horse, then someone could get that close with a gun. It was not that long after there was a news report about a son and a father seeing a Bigfoot cross the road near a local state park. The news report was just within a couple of weeks of my sighting, but I kept my sighting to myself. When I was very young, I saw a pair of Bigfoot tracks with my father. I'm guessing I was about 9 years old. I'm now 22. My father and I used to go rabbit hunting all the time. We always went to the same place and always saw dozens and dozens of rabbits. We would get up very early in the morning, about 1 a.m., so that we could get to our spot about an hour before dawn. So it was a few hours outside of Bishop, California. We would make sure to get there early so that we could sit there in the car and wait for dawn to come. Just as the sun would start to rise and there was enough light to see, we would normally see tons and tons of rabbits running about. But that day was different. There was not a single rabbit in sight. That had never happened before. We stayed in the truck and waited until the sun was fully up before we decided to get out and take a stroll around to see if there was anything else. Just before we left the truck, my dad asked me if I wanted to bring the camera, and I told him, nah, we aren't going to see anything out here. Boy, was I mistaken. We took off from the truck and went into the wilderness. There was nothing to see at all. No animals anywhere. We were walking along and suddenly we came upon the giant footprints in the sand. There were 2 sets of prints, one right next to the other. They were barefoot and looked just like human feet. Right away we knew what they were. It's a natural thing that goes through your mind. When you see them, you say to yourself, those are Bigfoot tracks. The first set of tracks were huge, and 3 times as big as my father's feet, and he is about 6'3", with a good-sized foot. He is very thin, though. The second set of footprints was the same size as mine, right next to its parents' tracks. The tracks dug deep into the ground, and my father and I talked about that. We tried to stomp on the ground to see if we could make an indent as deep as theirs, but we couldn't, even with our shoes on. We followed the tracks, and we came to a barbed wire fence. On the other side was a paved road. On the other side of the road was a hill that went up and overlooked a valley. I was too young to notice anything about how the tracks crossed the fence and got to the road, or if there was a piece of fur on the barbs, so I'm sorry that I couldn't tell you any more about that. On the other side of the road, there were no tracks, and we couldn't find any more around. My father decided that we needed the camera, so I stayed at the fence while he went back the way he came to get back to the truck. It seemed like it took forever for him to return, and being a little kid, I was getting a little scared. But he finally came back and told me that he could not find the truck. So when we were done looking around, we took the road that he had found to see where it would lead us. It took us to a small town that we had passed to get our spot. So we knew where we were. From there, we were able to finally get back to our truck, and once we were there, we decided we had gotten enough walking done for the day, so we headed home. A friend and I went driving to camp in Oregon on Highway 199 in the fall of 1985. We didn't want to stay at a pay site, so we pulled off on a side spur road in dense forest and set up tent. We had our 2 Malamute Cross dogs with us, who had been by our sides in many backcountry adventures. As we set up our sleeping bags in the tent, the dogs began growling very menacingly with the hair up full on their backs. We thought there might have been a bear around and worried that they would take off after it and be difficult to catch. We left them outside anyway and crawled into our bags to sleep. Then the dogs began whimpering and trying to claw their way into the tent. We nervously let them in, and not long afterwards began to hear howling. First, just one voice, but then followed by many voices. I would estimate that the sounds came from about 100 yards away. It was reminiscent of hearing a coyote pack or a wolf pack, but these were not canine voices. They ranged in pitch from childlike to adult male and higher female voices. It sounded like a really loud frat party in the middle of nowhere on a stormy, blustery night in the dark. It sounded like the people were talking very loud but yet howling at the same time. I've had many experiences hearing coyote packs, and this was not what I heard. I have no further explanation. We braved through the night and got the heck out of there in the morning. The second experience I had at Avenue of the Giants was the same friend while we were hiking a trail there. It was again the fall of '85, about a month later than the first. We had a map with us and decided to cut a loop short by going cross-country through the dense redwood forest. Not long after we started, the dog we had with us, same as the one of the dogs previous, lunged out full on his leash and began dragging my friend up a steep incline. We reached the top and noticed large foot-shaped impressions, maybe 14 to 18 inches long and 8 to 10 inches wide, in the depth below. Above us on the length of ground the dog drug us through. Branches were snapped off clean up to 10 feet high on the trees. We made our way back to the main trail with no further incident. On May 18th, 1991, while on vacation in the Mammoth Lakes area in Northern California, my family took a short day hike to Mono Lake to do some sightseeing. It was overcast and very cold with a strong wind blowing. There was still snow on the surrounding peaks. Mono Lake is at the base of the Sierra Nevada mountains. I do not recall the location at which we parked the car to begin our hike, but I do remember that ours was the only car in the parking lot area and that the spot was quite desolate. It was a cold Saturday morning and the area was deserted. At 9:17 a.m., I began shooting VHS video footage of our trek, and after a short period of time, we finally decided to leave because of the wind and cold. We went back to our hotel in June Lake, enjoyed the rest of the weekend, and went home. The trip was quite uneventful, or so we assumed. The tape went into our family home video collection, and for 17 years, from 91 to 2008, it has been watched countless times by family and friends. So much so that my kids have the dialogue on much of the tape collection memorized. On April 19th, 2008, my daughter, who's 6 years old in the video and is now 22, was watching the tape in the downstairs family room when she suddenly screamed out and began yelling for me to come downstairs. I thought something bad had happened, and after racing down the staircase, found my daughter and my ex sitting in front of the television telling me to watch a segment from the tape. What I saw when we played it back made the hair stand up on the back of my neck, and it was something none of us had ever noticed in almost 17 years of watching this same tape. In the final few seconds of the Mono Lake segment, just before I turned the camera off, I caught something very large and black moving between two rock formations a short distance from where we had been hiking. It was completely black, with no differentiation in color or texture, and walked upright like a human, but with a gait more like a primate. At first, I thought it was a bear, but after going over the video many times and finally digitizing and sharpening it, I'm now unsure what to think. From examination of the footage of my family, whose distance from the camera was comparable to that of the creature, it is easy to see the distinct details and variation in clothing, hair, face, and hands. In contrast, the creature caught on tape exhibits none of those distinctions. The shape of the body does not resemble a human. The head is too large, and the arms are too long. And although it does resemble a bear at one particular angle in the clip, the stance and gait don't add up. It is an intriguing mystery. That we were able to go for 17 years without ever noticing this event on tape seems unbelievable. But in retrospect, it actually makes some sense. This segment lasts for only a couple of seconds, and the focus is on the lake and mountains, which is what I must have been filming at the time. I didn't see it when I shot the tape, and it has since gone unnoticed because one must really be looking for it to see it. I'm not a person who is prone to believing in conspiracy theories, alien abductions, and bizarre events such as a purported Bigfoot sighting. I've seen various footage and photographs of Bigfoot Sasquatch sightings over the years, and have always been extremely skeptical of their authenticity. As an engineer who now teaches high school physics, I am highly educated and very level-headed. If I see something I don't understand, my natural reaction is to analyze it rationally using this scientific method. I do not jump to conclusions based on a faulty hypothesis. So in this case, I will suspend judgment pursuant to further investigation. But having shown this video to family and friends whose opinions I trust, the overall reaction seems to be a unanimous Bigfoot. Wishful thinking? Maybe. Maybe not. Either way, it is very intriguing and definitely warrants further investigation. About 15 years ago, I was 17, 18. I went on a hike with a friend trying to reach Smith Mountain on the edge of San Gabriel Wilderness. We made it to the saddle where the trail goes downhill into the wilderness, and where we were supposed to leave the trail and go south up the mountain, and decided we didn't feel like going any further. I'm assuming we rested for a while, and I remember just talking and hanging out. As we were getting up and ready to go, we heard a strange noise coming from the bushes nearby. We stopped talking and listened, and it was a very loud, very low sort of growl, snuffling sound. My first thought was that it was probably a bear, but that ultimately I had no idea what it was, and it sounded like it was growling at us. The bushes along the trail were so very high, such so that we couldn't even see through them. It scared the hell out of us, and we quickly hoofed it back down the trail. I'm not sure if we ever spoke about it again, except to maybe say I wondered what it was, that was scary, etc. But afterwards, I actually looked through the field guides, trying to figure out what was making the noise. I knew that bears, mountain lions, and bobcats are relatively prevalent in that part of San Gabriel Mountains, so I assumed it was probably one of those. But after looking around at other sightings near that area, I'm beginning to wonder. In retrospect, it sounded a bit ape-like, very low-pitched, so that we almost couldn't hear it at all, and had to ask each other, "Do you hear that?" Take it as you must. I just think it's an interesting in the context of the other sightings to the area. I only wish I could remember any more details and that we had the cojones to hang around longer and check it out further. Saw a form walking upright at a distance of 200 plus yards. We were a little excited, but more like scared shitless. There was enough light to just make out whatever it was. It was moving on 2 legs. We found where it had gouged out the soft earth on the stream it crossed. No discernible footprints, but whatever made the gouge was big. We had to wild-ass guess at the length. Over 19 inches. It was longer than the tip of my extended fingers to my elbow. The grass growing across the meadow didn't allow for footprints, but was pressed down several hours later. We didn't follow the trail towards the trees. It had been watching us for around 15 minutes, give or take 5. I was asleep when my friend woke me up. Said he heard something moving above us on the exposed rock above our camp. He had his 9mm personal protection from the typical axe murderer you meet while camping in hand and was a little wound up. We listened to it move around with the occasional skip like somebody was jumping a short distance to another rock. It moved behind us and then down into the meadow that surrounded the stream we were camping on. We saw it cross the stream and slip as it went across on the other side. It moved across the meadow at a quartering angle away from us and into the tree line. We know it wasn't a bear. We had several run-ins with bears trying to get our food cache at night in Yosemite. Thought we would get away from the crowds on his backpacking trip. Good call, huh? Once we calmed down, we discussed what we think we saw. We both came to the same conclusion. I know we did not hallucinate. Our eyes had time to adjust before we finally got a visual of it moving across the meadow. We stayed awake until we had enough light to look the area over quickly, and then beat feet out of there. 2 years ago, I went with my uncle to stay at a cabin in Mammoth Lakes to hike, fish, and just enjoy the nature. We had a cabin right on the border of Lake Mary, and he had brought his 2 sheepdogs with him to the cabin. Every night, he and I would take turns taking the dogs out for a walk. He would bring a flashlight with us each time we went out to walk with the dogs. One night when I was walking the dogs, one of them started growling and listened closely and could hear the rustling of fallen leaves and the breaking of small branches. I shined my light right at where I heard the sounds. Now, both of the dogs were growling and pulling at the leash, trying to get at whatever was in the forest. I looked around closely with the flashlight, and then I saw something. A huge figure, about 200 feet away from me, was watching me and the dogs. It was kind of swaying between the trees and just staring right at me and the dogs. It looked like a very tall ape, but it looked more built like a human. I was scared stiff, and I must have stood there for a minute or two, holding the dogs back and staring at the creature when it turned around and started walking away. I then walked very fast back to the cabin, watching the woods and not stopping for anything. I have never spoken of this incident with anyone before in my life, and I have recently heard about this sight and thought it was finally time to talk about this with somebody who would understand. On the night of July 8th, 2006, at Malakoff Historical State Park, I heard a man-sized creature run up behind me and stop. I shone my flashlight and saw a pair of eyes downhill from me, but they were as tall as I. I screamed and threw my flashlight at my husband and wanted him to see for himself. There was nothing there when the men looked around, and there was also no sound of a spooked animal running away. Instead, we heard quiet and cautious footsteps heading away from our campsite. This was no bear or coyote. It was huge, at least 6 feet tall and quiet. I wish I would have stared longer, but I was freaked out. In late September 1989, I was deer hunting about 5 miles west of Walker's Pass along Highway 178. I had driven a short ways off the highway and then walked about a quarter of a mile to a rocky bluff that was at the base of a very large, steep mountain. I believe it was Pinyon Peak. While sitting there in the dark, I continually had the feeling that I was being watched. I have had this same feeling 2 other times, and in both situations, I spotted a mountain lion watching me from a distance. As gray light came, I started glassing the steep, dense mountain behind me and looking for whatever it was that was watching me. I really could not see very much as it was still fairly dark, and the brush was so thick. I cannot remember how long it was that I was glassing the area when a very loud, booming scream echoes from the mountain behind me, several hundred yards up. It sounded almost like a terrified woman screaming as loud as she could. At first, I thought that somebody was just playing a hoax on me. The more I looked at how steep the mountain was, the time of day, early morning because I only had gray light, and how dense it is up there, the more uneasy I became. I left the area immediately. My girlfriend, who later became my wife, and I were traveling on a rural road, Panama Road, that connects the outskirts of Bakersfield, California, to Lamont, California, just a small town 14 miles outside of Bakersfield. This area is surrounded by agricultural fields, mostly grape vineyards. I was traveling at approximately 55 miles an hour. That was pushing it for my '65 Mustang at the time. As we talked, we both saw something walking very fast, almost a slow jog across the roadway. I slowed down without slamming on the brakes so as to not lose control and try to figure out what we were seeing. We saw its right side and back as it ran into the field. The head to the shoulders was slouched, could not see a neck. It was approximately 6 feet tall, long arms and thick legs. It never looked at us as it crossed. It was extremely dark, almost shadowy, but very much real. Appeared to be very hairy. As we passed it, it never looked back. I quickly stopped and began a U-turn, at which time my girlfriend yelled at me, asking what the hell I was doing. She knew what I was about to do. I drove back to the location to where it ran into the field, and I hit my bright lights. Did not see anything. My girlfriend was yelling at me to get going, so I did. I returned to the area the following day, but it had rained and I could not locate any footprints. It was too muddy. My wife will only discuss it if I bring it up. Aside from that, she never talks about it. To this day, I have no idea what we saw. I know that it was not human as we know it, yet I cannot say that it was a complete animal either. I still drive by there once in a while and wonder what it was that we saw that night.